I never talk about my birthday. It's not that I hate the idea of it. I mean, who wouldn't want a day all about them? But there's a weight that comes with it, a pressure that builds every time the date gets close, like a storm gathering at the edge of a horizon. It's not something I can explain to people, not even my fiancée. She tries, though. Every year, she asks, with that sweet concern in her voice, "Why don't you ever celebrate your birthday? Was it something that happened when you were younger?" And every year, I smile, shake my head, and tell her it's no big deal. But it is. It always has been. I just can't say why. This year was no different. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the cake she'd made, the candles flickering in front of me like they were daring me to make a wish. But my mind was somewhere else, pulled back to when I turned 13. That was the year everything changed. The year of the lockdown. The year I stopped being a kid. And the funny thing is, I hadn't even thought about what I'd wished for back then, on the morning of my 13th birthday. I just remember feeling hopeful. Excited, even. That was before he showed up. It was early evening when the knock came. I remember my mom was making dinner, something simple like spaghetti. My dad was still at work, and I was in the living room, flipping through channels when I heard the knock. It wasn't a friendly, neighborly kind of knock. It was sharp, precise, official. I saw my mom pause, a strange look flashing across her face before she wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. And when she opened it, there he was, clipboard man. He didn't look like much at first. Just some guy in a suit, maybe in his 30s, with a clipboard tucked under his arm. But there was something about the way he stood there, so calm, so detached, that made my skin crawl. He didn't even greet my mom properly, just showed her the clipboard and said, "Ma'am, there's been an incident in the area. We're implementing a 72-hour lockdown." His voice was so even, so rehearsed, like he'd done this 100 times before. "There's been a chemical exposure. It reacts violently with sleep. No one in your household is to fall asleep. Not for 72 hours. My mom's face went pale. I think at first she thought it was some kind of prank or mistake. I mean, who the hell tells people they can't sleep for 72 hours? But then she saw the armed guards on the street, 3 of them, standing there with rifles slung over their shoulders. Their faces looked tired, worn out, like they'd been up for days. That's when I knew it wasn't a joke. Something was seriously wrong. Clipboard man explained quickly, his words clipped and precise. A chemical had been released somewhere nearby. How or why wasn't clear, but it reacted with REM sleep in a way that could kill you. If you fall asleep, he said, you won't wake up. He wasn't offering any comfort either. No explanations beyond the basics, just a set of rules. We had to hand over all phones and communication devices. The internet would be cut off. And we were forbidden from leaving the house. Then he gave us these small, preloaded syringes, booster shots to keep us awake. I remember the first shot stinging a little, but it wasn't the physical pain that got to me. It was the silence that followed after Clipboard Man left. My mom just stood there, the door still open, staring down the street where the guards were now stationed at both ends of the block. There were no cars, no people, just this eerie, enforced stillness. It felt like we'd been cut off from the world, as if the outside didn't exist anymore. When my dad got home, he didn't take the news well. He was always the protector, the serious one, and he hated not having control over a situation. I watched as my parents argued in the kitchen, their voices low but intense. My mom kept trying to reassure him, saying things like, "It's just 3 days. We'll be fine." But my dad wasn't having it. "They can't just lock us up like this without telling us why," he kept saying. "There's more to this. There has to be." By the time night fell, the tension in our house was palpable. My mom busied herself in the kitchen again, trying to act like things were normal, but her hands were shaking. My dad kept pacing, checking the windows like he was expecting something worse to happen. And me? I just sat there, trying to understand how my 13th birthday had turned into something out of a nightmare. All I wanted was to play my new video game and have dinner with my family. Instead, I was stuck in some kind of government lockdown, unable to sleep, with no idea what was coming next. As I lay on the couch that night, staring at the ceiling, I remember hearing the faint sound of footsteps outside. Those guards, probably. They seemed just as trapped as we were, standing there, rifles in hand, their faces pale and tired. I wondered how long they had been awake. What would happen to them if they fell asleep? Would we be next? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The first night was the hardest, or at least that's what I thought at the time. Looking back, I had no idea just how much worse things would get. But that night, as darkness crept through the windows and the house settled into an unnatural stillness, it felt like the walls were closing in. I could hear my dad pacing upstairs, his heavy footsteps a reminder that none of us could rest. Sleep was not an option. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the lawn. I remember looking out the window, trying to make sense of what was happening. Frank Morrison was outside, pacing like a caged animal. Frank lived 2 doors down, and he was the kind of neighbor who kept to himself, mostly working nights. But that evening, he looked different. His eyes were wild, darting around like he was trying to find something he couldn't see. He kept muttering to himself, his hands shaking, though I couldn't hear the words. My stomach twisted. I'd never seen him like that before. Inside, the air felt thick, like it was charged with some kind of invisible tension. My mom was trying to keep it together, pretending to be calm as she cleaned dishes that didn't need cleaning. She kept glancing at the clock on the wall, as if watching the minutes would make them go faster. My dad, on the other hand, was unraveling. He sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the pile of confiscated electronics, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. "This isn't right," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "They can't just shut us off from the world. What if this is something else? What if it's a test?" The words sent a chill through me, but I didn't dare ask what he meant. Instead, I sat there, too afraid to move, my heart pounding in my chest. The booster shot they'd given us earlier had kicked in, and I felt wired, like I'd drunk way too much caffeine. My eyes were dry and itchy, but my mind was racing. I kept thinking about what Clipboard Man had said. If you fall asleep, you won't wake up. I couldn't stop imagining what would happen if I slipped into unconsciousness. Would I feel it? Would I even know? The night stretched on, endless and oppressive. Around midnight, something strange started happening. My mom went to get a glass of milk from the fridge, and when she poured it into the cup, the milk came out thick and clumpy. She frowned, sniffed the carton, then wrinkled her nose. "It's spoiled," she said, her voice small. "It's gone bad overnight." I remember her staring at it like it was some kind of warning, but none of us could explain why it bothered us so much. That wasn't the only thing. Outside, the trees in our front yard, just regular oaks and maples, looked off. Their leaves, usually a deep green, had taken on this weird, almost sickly hue, like they'd been dipped in something unnatural. I pointed it out to my mom, but she just shook her head. "We're all tired," she said. "It's probably nothing." But I could tell she didn't believe that. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, a loud crash echoed from down the street. I jumped up from the couch, my pulse racing, and rushed to the window. I wasn't the only one. My dad bolted to the door, unlocking it just enough to peer outside. That's when we saw Frank Morrison again, this time standing in the street, barefoot and screaming. His wife, Mrs. Morrison, was crying, trying to pull him back inside their house. But Frank was too far gone. He was shouting at the top of his lungs, something about the sky bleeding, and the world turning to rot. I could barely make sense of it. Then it happened. Frank lunged at Mrs. Morrison, grabbing her by the shoulders and shaking her violently. His eyes were bloodshot, veins bulging in his neck, and as he screamed, His voice cracked, turning into something animalistic. Before anyone could stop him, he slammed her against the front door. The sickening thud echoed down the street. My dad tried to rush outside, but the armed guards were already there, pushing him back with their rifles and telling us to stay inside. They dragged Frank away, his body convulsing. And that's when I saw it, the black and blue goo dripping from his mouth. I stood frozen at the window, watching as they shoved him into the back of a military van, his limbs twitching uncontrollably. Mrs. Morrison was on the ground, unconscious or worse, but the guards didn't seem to care. They just left her there. My dad slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. "What the hell is going on out there?" he growled, pacing again, more frantic this time. My mom was sitting on the couch, pale and trembling. She hadn't said a word since the incident. I could see the fear in her eyes, the kind that burrows deep and doesn't let go. The kind I was feeling, too. We spent the rest of the night in silence, too scared to sleep, too scared to even talk about what we'd seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Frank's face, twisted in rage and terror, the black goo oozing from his mouth. And every time I forced them open again, terrified of what might happen if I didn't. By the time dawn crept over the horizon, the street was eerily quiet. No birds sang. No cars passed. The guards stood motionless at the ends of the block, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces drawn and exhausted. It felt like the world had ended, and we were the last ones left, trapped in a nightmare that had no intention of letting us go. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The second night was coming, and none of us were ready for what would happen next. The second night was worse. A part of me thought maybe things would settle, that the guards had everything under control, and that Frank Morrison was just a one-off, a freak reaction to the chemical. But deep down, I knew better. We all did. The air felt different that day, thicker somehow, like you could feel the tension in every breath you took. It was the kind of quiet that presses down on you, making you feel like something terrible is about to happen. And it did. My mom had been coughing on and off since the first night. At first, we thought it was nothing, maybe a side effect of the booster shots, or just exhaustion catching up with her. But by the second afternoon, it got worse. She tried to hide it, brushing off our concerns with weak smiles and saying she was fine, just tired. I wasn't buying it. I could see the dark circles under her eyes deepening, her skin turning pale. Something was happening to her. We had no way of contacting anyone for help. The phones were still gone, the internet cut off. We were isolated, alone in our house, with only the sound of my mom's labored breathing and the distant footsteps of the guards outside. My dad was restless, snapping at every little thing. I knew he was scared, even if he wouldn't admit it. He kept pacing between the kitchen and the living room, muttering about how this doesn't add up, about how there's no way they didn't see this coming. That evening, my mom's coughing got worse. She couldn't keep food down, and her eyes had this glazed-over look, like she was there but not really there. I remember sitting next to her on the couch, trying to distract her with some story I made up on the spot, anything to keep her mind off how sick she was feeling. But she wasn't listening. She kept drifting in and out, her eyelids drooping dangerously low. My dad had warned me not to let her fall asleep, no matter what. The terror in his voice had made it clear this wasn't just a precaution. It was life or death. It happened suddenly. 1 minute, she was sitting there, her head leaning against the couch, and the next, she slumped over. I shook her, gently at first, then harder. "Mom, Mom, wake up." My voice cracked, panic rising in my chest. I called for my dad, who rushed in from the kitchen, his face going pale the moment he saw her. "No, no, no, not yet," he mumbled, shaking her harder than I had. "You can't. Not yet." Her body twitched violently, and she started convulsing, her mouth opening wide, as a thick, black goo poured out. It mixed with something else, blue, almost fluorescent, seeping from her nose and eyes. It was horrifying. Something out of a nightmare. And yet I couldn't look away. My dad kept shaking her, screaming at her to wake up. But it was too late. Her body was giving in, collapsing under the weight of whatever that chemical had done to her. I couldn't move. I was frozen, watching my dad crumble before my eyes as my mom's body seized and twitched, her chest rising and falling rapidly, like she was struggling to hold on. But the goo kept coming, pooling on the floor, thick and sticky, like something rotten had burst inside her. I thought about what Clipboard Man had said. If you fall asleep, you won't wake up. But this wasn't just sleep. This was something else, something darker. I didn't want to know what came next. My dad finally stopped shaking her, his hands trembling as he backed away. He looked at me, his face twisted in agony, and I could see the fear in his eyes, the kind of fear that comes when you realize you're powerless. "We have to get her out of here," he muttered, but his voice was hollow. He knew as well as I did that there was nothing we could do. That's when the guards came. They must have been watching, waiting for this moment, because they showed up almost immediately. Two of them, looking as exhausted as we felt, knocked on the door and let themselves in. They didn't ask permission. They didn't need to. My dad tried to argue, tried to tell them we could still help her. But they weren't listening. They lifted my mom's limp body like she weighed nothing and carried her out the front door, leaving a trail of that black and blue goo behind them. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. But I didn't. I just stood there, numb, as the door closed behind them, as if my mom had never been there at all. My dad sank into the nearest chair, his head in his hands, and for the first time in my life, I saw him break. He was always the strong one, the one who knew what to do, but now he was lost. The house felt emptier after that, colder. My dad barely spoke, and when he did, it was just more of the same. How this couldn't be happening, how none of this made sense. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was too busy watching the street, seeing how the rest of the neighborhood was falling apart. The guards had taken Frank Morrison the night before, but his house was still boarded up, and no one knew what had happened to Mrs. Morrison. More people had started roaming the streets, their bodies twitching and convulsing like they were trying to hold on, but slowly slipping away. By the time night fell, the street looked like a war zone. I could see shadows moving between the houses, people stumbling, bodies twisted in unnatural ways. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, eyes wide open but empty, like they were stuck in some waking nightmare. They didn't make any sense, but neither did anything else. I watched them from the window, my dad muttering to himself in the background, his words slurred and tired. He hadn't slept in nearly 48 hours now, and I could see him unraveling in slow motion. I knew it was only a matter of time before we joined them, before whatever was happening out there came for us too. By the time the third night came, the house felt more like a tomb than a home. The absence of my mom hung over us like a shadow, pressing down, suffocating. My dad, once so certain and strong, had started to unravel. His face was gaunt, eyes bloodshot, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He was muttering constantly now, repeating the same paranoid thoughts like a broken record. "They did this to us," he'd say over and over again. "This isn't an accident. We're just experiments." I didn't argue with him, but I didn't agree either. I didn't have the energy. My own body felt like it was on the verge of collapse. It had been 72 hours since I last slept, but it felt like a lifetime. My limbs were heavy, my thoughts slow and muddled, and the lines between reality and nightmare had started to blur. I couldn't tell what was real anymore, and that terrified me more than anything. My dad barricaded the doors that night. He shoved furniture against them, even nailed boards across the windows like we were in some kind of horror movie. I could hear him mumbling to himself as he worked, his words quick and frantic. He hadn't eaten since my mom was taken away, and I could see the toll it was taking on him, his skin pale and slick with sweat. eyes wide and wild. I wanted to help, to say something that might bring him back from the edge, but I was too tired, too scared. That's when the pounding started. It was distant at first, barely noticeable over the sound of my dad's hammering. But soon, it grew louder, more frantic. Someone, or something, was banging on the door. My dad froze, his eyes darting toward the sound. And for a moment, I thought he might snap out of it. But then he turned to me, his face twisted in a grimace of fear and rage. "They're here," he whispered. "They're coming for us." I backed away, my heart racing. Who's coming? The guards. But deep down, I already knew it wasn't the guards. The guards had stopped patrolling hours ago. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't coming to help us. They were coming to finish what had started. The banging grew louder, more insistent. My dad grabbed a kitchen knife and stood in front of the door, his knuckles white around the handle. "Stay back," he warned, his voice barely above a growl. "I won't let them take us." But it wasn't the government or the guards that broke down the door. It was the infected, the people who had succumbed to the chemical, the ones who had fallen asleep and never woke up properly. They looked like twisted versions of themselves, faces pale, eyes wide open but hollow, their bodies twitching and jerking like they were fighting some invisible force. I recognized some of them, neighbors who lived down the street, people I'd waved to on my way to school. Now, they were monsters. They pushed through the barricade, their hands clawing at the doorframe, their mouths opening and closing like they were trying to speak but couldn't find the words. My dad screamed at them, waving the knife wildly, but it didn't matter. They didn't care about the knife. They didn't care about anything except getting inside. I ran. I didn't even think about it. I just turned and ran. My legs felt like lead, and my vision blurred at the edges, but adrenaline kept me moving. I sprinted upstairs, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. Behind me, I could hear the infected tearing through the house, their footsteps heavy and uncoordinated, like they weren't fully in control of their own bodies. I heard my dad scream, a guttural, terrified sound that chilled me to the bone. And then, nothing. Just silence. I didn't stop. I threw myself into the closet in my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the lock. I pressed my back against the wall, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible. My breathing was ragged, uneven, but I tried to stay quiet. I tried not to think about what was happening downstairs. The silence didn't last long. Soon, I could hear them again, their footsteps thudding up the stairs, the sound of furniture being knocked over, the walls shaking as they moved through the house. I could hear them breathing. Raspy, shallow gasps, like they were struggling just to exist. They were getting closer, and I knew if they found me, it was over. I squeezed my eyes shut, holding my breath, waiting. I could hear them in my room now, shuffling around, their footsteps heavy against the floor. Something slammed into the closet door, hard enough to make it rattle on its hinges, and I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. All I could do was hope that they'd move on, that they wouldn't find me. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I lost track of time, my mind too hazy, too full of fear to think clearly. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, and the house fell quiet again. I didn't move. I couldn't trust the quiet. For all I knew, they were still out there, waiting for me to slip up, waiting for me to let my guard down. Hours passed. I don't know how long I stayed in that closet, but by the time I finally dared to move, the sun was rising. I peeked out through a crack in the door, my heart racing, and saw that the hallway was empty. The house was trashed, furniture overturned, the walls smeared with that black and blue goo, but the infected were gone. For now. I stumbled out of the house, my legs weak and shaking. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The street was empty, too, silent, deserted, as if the whole neighborhood had been swallowed up by some unseen force. I wandered for hours, or maybe days. I wasn't sure anymore. All I knew was that I had survived, but I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on.